New edition of the Patriots Beat podcast here on the CLNS Media Podcast Network and on Patriots Press Pass on YouTube. I'm Evan Lazar, joined as always by Alex Barth. It's Super Bowl week, but a lot of news coming out today for the Patriots. Not about the Bengals, not about the Los Angeles Rams necessarily, Alex. And we're going to preview the Super Bowl on Thursday with our pal Trags, who's in Los Angeles. So if you want Super Bowl coverage, go ahead and follow Trags for all of your Super Bowl 56, I believe it is, right? Yep, 56 coverage out there in LA. But we're going to start today, and I'm sure a lot of people are watching us in the B's and the C's. So we appreciate you guys joining us on a Tuesday night a little bit later than usual. We start with the news of the day, and that is that the Patriots not only have brought Joe Judge home to the coaching staff, they have announced the hire, which I actually don't think is insignificant because for the most part, when the Patriots make these coaching moves, for example, last year with Matt Patricia, Alex, there was never an announcement. We kind of showed up, there was reports of it. Then we showed up at training camp and he was in the media guide as a whatever his official title is, liaison, consultant, assistant to the head coach, I think is technically the title for Patricia. This one was formally announced by the team, released by the team's Twitter account, blasted to the media, and Joe Judge is officially an offensive assistant for the Patriots. So now the question is, what does that mean? How much involvement is he going to have in the respect of him essentially being an offensive coordinator or a de facto offensive coordinator? But first, Alex, your reaction to Joe Judge coming back home to New England.
Yeah, I don't hate it in a bubble. I think he's somebody to have in the building. We talked about him potentially, taking over some sort of a special teams role after special teams weren't ideal this year. I still don't buy him. Forget offensive coordinator. I still don't buy him as an offensive coach. I still don't. Before he got into special teams, when he began his career, before he's with the Patriots, he started off as a linebackers coach. He was a special teams coach before coming to New England, was a special teams coach at New England. They threw that wide receiver coach title at him, but that was in 2019. How'd the wide receiver development go in 2019? I don't buy it. Again, I think he's a good voice to have in the building. I think he's a good brain to have in the building. And they don't always have coaches stick to their role. When Troy Brown was officially the running backs coach, he was with receivers a lot. So I'm assuming what they're telling us versus what he's actually going to do are two different things. But that's how I feel. That's how I feel about it.
That's a fair read on it. And certainly Daniel Jones under Joe Judge over the last 2 years was a disaster in New York. The 31st ranked offense in the 2 seasons that Judge was the head coach with the Giants, to the point where they bring in Brian Daboll as the head coach, they hire Mike Kafka as the quarterback's coach, and they've basically done everything under the sun now in New York to make the quarterback possible, right? To make the quarterback good because of how bad things were for Daniel Jones under Joe Judge. So I totally understand everybody's reservations with this. Now, talking to people putting things together here today, it does sound like Judge is going to have some OC responsibilities. I'm not ready to go as far as saying that he's going to be the play caller, but I do think that he's going to have some responsibilities in the direction of the offense in general, the game planning week to week, and have a hand in a lot of the big decision-making processes of the offense during the season. He is not here to be a Matt Patricia. He is not here to advise Bill Belichick and to walk around and chat on the side with players and pull guys aside and give his 2 cents when it's asked. He is here to be a coach and to be hands-on and to be involved on the offensive side of the ball. Now, my sense is that this is not the only move that's coming for the Patriots on offense, but I don't think that there's going to be another big shoe to drop. The next shoe that does drop is going to be a size 9, not a size 16, right? I don't think we're going to get into one of those big name coordinator hires. I'll talk about it in a second. Why not Bill O'Brien? And I have some theories as to why maybe Bill O'Brien isn't coming here to New England. But the way that I am putting it together now with this hire with Joe Judge, and we were just talking about this before we hit record, is that the Patriots are trying to build offensively what they have on the defensive side of the ball, where Joe Judge is essentially Gerard Mayo, right? He has a pretty big say in game planning. He leads meetings. He has a lot of discussions involved in terms of the stylistic approach on that side of the football, but maybe isn't the primary play caller. The primary play caller is still yet to be seen. It could be Mick Lombardi. His name has come up a lot, and he has really garnered a lot of attention in recent weeks, I would say more so than when we first started talking about this when Josh McDaniels left for the Raiders. Last couple of days, last week or so, Mick Lombardi's name has begun to surface a lot more as somebody that they're high on internally and that could take on more responsibility. So maybe they feel Mick Lombardi could be somebody that takes on those play calling duties. I still am not sleeping on Adam Gase potentially being on this staff come training camp. And maybe they get into a situation where Judge and Adam Gase are essentially co-offensive coordinators, but neither guy has the title. It could be that way with Mick Lombardi too, or an internal candidate as well. So I'm not totally sold that Joe Judge is going to be the play caller, but I'm pretty certain that he's going to have a pretty big say in a lot of the game planning and a lot of the hands-on stuff that has to go on behind the scenes on the coaching staff.
Yeah, and that's concerning to me. This is where I'm more so concerned. Like I said, I don't necessarily mind Joe Judge as an individual being in the building. What I'm more concerned about is what happened on defense happening on offense, because the defensive side of the ball has a lot more talent than the offensive side of the ball. And look, who knows what it'll look like after the offseason. But the defense, in spite of everything that happened with the coaching staff, was still the second-ranked defense in the league. What does the offense look like if wires get crossed? The other thing is, on defense, you have guys like Devin McCourty, like Donta Hightower, who have been around, who know what they're doing, who are essentially like coaches on the field. The most important long-term storyline for this team is Mac Jones' development. And now you're going to make that unclear. So I think the one thing they absolutely have to do, if they're going to go with this convoluted, flow chart on offense, which I don't think they should do, but if they're going to do that, the one thing they absolutely have to do is have a defined quarterbacks coach. That role was split last year between Josh McDaniels and Bo Hardigree. I don't necessarily think splitting it between those two guys specifically was a bad idea. I think it obviously worked. Mac was good last year. I think you need a dedicated quarterbacks coach who is not named Adam Gase on the staff. I think that is now, if they're going to do, like, short of bringing in Bill O'Brien as a defined offense coordinator, finding a dedicated and competent quarterbacks coach to work with Mac is now priority one for the staff for the rest of the offseason. I think that has to be the next step.
It's a horrible setup for Mac Jones. There's no other way to put it. I think the thought process has always been for Bill Belichick. Do we have breaking news? Is that why you're...
It's not Patriots, but it's significant.
Oh, okay. Well, you can share it if you want.
So, Fluto Shinzawa just now on The Athletic. Bruins don't expect Tuukka Rask to continue comeback attempt, per sources.
Oh, wow.
So Tuukka Rask, is that...
So
it doesn't use the word retire, but Tom Brady didn't use the word retire either.
So Tuukka's done. I think Jess is going to be heartbroken when I tell her if she doesn't know
already. He's the greatest goalie in the history of the franchise. That's a big one. Anyway, sorry. I know it's not. Go find the Evans. The Evans will talk. Oh no, it's Evan and Connor. Evans are you and him.
Yes.
Evan Marinofsky, Connor Ryan. I'm sure they'll talk about it. But that's kind of a big one in terms of Boston sports. That's a big one.
Very big. Let's bring it back to Patriots.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. And talking about Mac Jones' development here, I think is really the biggest thing. When Josh McDaniels took the Raiders job, I think the outcry, and maybe this was just on our show, in our comment section, in my Twitter replies, was that this could ultimately be a blessing in disguise because they could get some fresh perspectives. They could get some new ideas. They could get some more innovation going on offense and get some more adaptation, right? In terms of just college game stuff, RPOs, spread elements, things that we've talked about on the show. I think what we're learning here quickly is that the grass is not always greener on the other side. And the one thing that you can definitely say about Josh McDaniels And his ability to mentor and bring along Mac Jones last season was an absolute home run from start to finish. Sure, you can nitpick the fact that McDaniels hands the ball off to Brandon Bolden on 3rd and short, or has a weird play calling sequence in the red zone, or was too conservative here or too conservative there. But his ability to develop Mac from the day that Mac Jones got in the building to the end of his rookie season was fantastic. He was fantastic at it. And at this point, I have real major concerns out of anything else that has to do with this, because the other point I wanted to make was, I think the biggest thing when it comes to both sides of the football for Bill Belichick is that he's trying to build a program where they're running the same system, the same playbook, regardless of who the coordinator is and regardless of who is calling the plays year in and year out, so that there's continuity across the board. So that when you lose a Josh McDaniels, all you have to do is elevate a Mick Lombardi or bring back a Joe Judge, and you start running the same program, right? You start running the same playbook that you were running before, and nobody ever skips a beat. But now they're in a situation with a young quarterback that needs grooming, that needs mentorship, that needs guidance. And this isn't just as simple as who's going to be calling the plays on Sundays. This has to go in practice, in film session, in review, in all the little details behind the scenes. Now, the one little bit of saving grace that I have about this for Mac is, if there's one guy, ironically, that isn't actually technically on the roster as of right now, but I think will be, that I might actually trust to bring Mac along, it's Brian Hoyer. And this formula for a lot of other teams and a lot of other OCs around the league, from Kevin O'Connell to Kellen Moore to all these quarterbacks, ex-backup quarterbacks turn play callers, turn offensive coordinators, Alex, this has worked in the past, and this continues to work around the league. So although Brian Hoyer is not going to officially be a coach, he's going to be brought back in the building to be a coach. He's getting paid like a player. He's going to wear a jersey, but he's out there on the practice field to coach Mac Jones. So maybe they do feel like, in a way, that Brian Hoyer is enough guidance in that sort of respect that they feel like Mac is in decent hands. But in terms of having this be convoluted between who's actually in charge, who's running the ship, who's in Mac Jones's ear, do we trust the people that they're putting in Mac Jones's ear? This is not a good situation moving forward for the quarterback. And I hope that there is something that they know that we don't about the situation. And maybe it is that Joe Judge is actually a lot smarter and brighter and better than we're giving him credit for. But ultimately, I have a tough time getting there as well.
Joe Judge, was it 19 that he was the wide receivers coach? I want to make sure I get this right.
19 was the wide receivers. And
okay.
You do have to mention that he was also the special teams coach.
I know, but
I'm just saying it was
a wide receiver who he was tasked with developing in 2019.
Yeah, there was a lot of responsibility on his plate, though, is my point.
There was. That's fair. Well, it sounds... I don't want him to be the quarterback's coach. I don't think he needs to be the quarterback's coach. And I don't know who it's going to be. It shouldn't be him. It shouldn't be Adam Gase. It should not be. I know you're going to keep saying it and say it's possible. If it's Adam Gase, it's a mistake. Adam Gase, as an offensive coordinator for a high school team, went 4-5, and his quarterback had a negative touchdown to interception ratio. And look, Mac Jones is a hell of a lot more talented. No offense to the quarterback at Lincoln High School in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Mac Jones is a hell of a lot more talented than that kid, but it's level playing field. The opponents aren't as talented either, all of that. You're telling me this great NFL mind, the quarterback whisperer, as his nickname once was, couldn't figure out a way to get a high school kid a positive touchdown interception ratio?
No, I don't like Adam Gase either.
Can't be Gase.
The name that I keep on hearing is Mick Lombardi. And maybe that's the way that they go about it. Is that they promote one guy from within, or they give one guy internally a little bit more responsibility, and they give Judge a overseer type of role as well.
He's the adult in the room. I'm not necessarily, I'm not talking about even play caller, though. I'm talking about like whoever's going to call plays is going to call plays at this point. If it's not Bill O'Brien, it's going to be somebody who either hasn't done it or doesn't have a lot of experience doing it. I'm already past that. To me, it's, well, who's the quarterback's coach? Who is in the meeting rooms with Mac?
Yeah.
Who is watching Mac and solely Mac on the field at practice, working on his mechanics, things like that? Like that, to me, is now the most important job. That can't be by committee. That can't be Joe Judge on Tuesday, Mick Lombardi on Wednesday, Nick Caley on Thursday, Matt Patricia on Friday, right? That's got to be somebody. And maybe it's Hoyer. Maybe it is. But Hoyer's also, for all we talk about, Hoyer's a great coach. He still wants to be ready in case he gets a chance to play. He's still doing his own thing to an extent. I want somebody just working with Mac Jones. I want to know who that is. And it needs to be somebody who knows what they're doing. And it needs to be the same person every day.
Yeah. And before we move to Bill O'Brien, because I have some thoughts on that as well, Mick Lombardi did coach quarterbacks at one point. They moved him over to wide receivers a couple years ago. He did coach quarterbacks for the Patriots, I want to say in 18 or 19. Granted, it was Tom Brady who he was coaching. So
he was the assistant quarterbacks coach in 19.
Yes. So he did coach quarterbacks at one point. So this shuffling technically could be as easy as Troy Brown getting full-time at wide receivers, right? And him becoming the full-time wide receivers coach, Mick Lombardi technically being the quarterbacks coach, and Joe Judge remaining as an offensive assistant as the bigger picture guy in the room.
Or even Joe Judge, who was a wide receivers coach, becoming the other wide receivers coach, right? And then moving Mick Lombardi to quarterbacks. I didn't realize Mick Lombardi had that role in 19. So
yes,
he's not the worst option. Again, I still think Bill O'Brien was the best option.
Yeah. So we can talk about Bill O'Brien. So this is interesting to me because when they when Josh McDaniels took the job with the Raiders, they had a conversation with Bill O'Brien, Bill O'Brien's reps. It was put out there. Ian Rappaport reporting about it. Adam Schefter, the big guns, coming in and saying there was mutual interest between the two parties. So at this point, I think it would be pretty far-fetched for Bill O'Brien to be the offensive coordinator for the Patriots. I'm not saying it's impossible, but my odds of it happening have dropped significantly from 50-50 to probably 10-15% chance that Bill O'Brien's on this staff next year. So I want to discuss a couple of the reasons or a couple of the theories that I have of why no Billy O, right? Why is Bill O'Brien not coming here? So I think the two biggest things that I can come up with are, number one, Bill Belichick and Nick Saban have had an understanding that unless it's mutually beneficial, unless that's really what the coach wants, they're not going to poach from each other's staffs, right? They're not going to go in and they're not going to just take guys from each other's staffs unless it's mutually agreed upon, unless the other guy has a good insurance policy, a good fallback plan, a good plan B, and maybe Nick Saban doesn't want to give up Bill O'Brien, right? The other theory that I have is that I think Bill O'Brien, differently from a guy like Joe Judge, is going to want a lot of autonomy with the offense. He's going to want a lot of control. I actually would go as far to say is that he might actually want a seat at the table with decision-making in terms of personnel, right? Who are they drafting? Who are they signing in free agency? How am I going to use that player? So this isn't as simple as we're just going to make you the play caller. I think Bill O'Brien was going to want a seat at the table, right? And similarly to what they gave to Josh McDaniels. So maybe Bill Belichick wasn't prepared to offer him that. Thirdly, you have to talk about pay, right? Because I'm sure Alabama's paying him a decent amount of money to be the OC down there. And you also have to talk about, is the job here in New England that much better for Bill O'Brien than going back to Alabama and coaching the reigning Heisman Trophy winner and putting up another great season of offense? I know they got some guys leaving in the draft, but Alabama's a factory. They're definitely going to have more guys coming up that he's going to be able to work with.
They still have Bryce Young. They still have Will Anderson.
Right. They still got Bryce Young at quarterback. So is it that attractive for Bill O'Brien to jump ship at this point and leave Alabama where he knows he's probably going to look good, right? He knows he's probably going to look pretty darn good. And whether it's Steve Sarkisian or Lane Kiffin, it's very, very plausible that Bill O'Brien could be a head coach just by being the Alabama offensive coordinator for a couple years, then jumping to a college program or even back to the NFL as a head coach if he does a good job there. So end of point is that the Patriots need Bill O'Brien a whole lot more than Bill O'Brien needs the Patriots. And so in order to get him here, I think they really needed to heavily pitch him and incentivize him on the idea of coming. And maybe they just couldn't really bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing you bring up there is some of the control maybe Bill O'Brien would want. What would the offense look like schematically? What would some of the personnel decisions be?
Right.
Because that's part of the reason at the same time, maybe that's part of the reason he won't come here, because he won't get that say. At the same time, isn't that kind of what made him the perfect candidate? Was introducing some of those RPOs, some of those more spread concepts. So I don't mean this as a take. I'm posing this question to you. I'm curious what you think about it. Is this an indication, if things hold the way they do, or at least, no more major moves, that the offense is more or less going to look like what it did last year under Josh McDaniels?
110%. I think that this playbook was never going to change fundamentally into anything else than what it currently is. Sure, another guy that's calling plays might have a different sequence of plays that he strings together. Maybe another guy has a different game plan for a certain opponent. But I go back to a quote that Bill Belichick had years ago, where he talked about how he wanted to keep the X's and O's the same. So that way, when he loses coordinators, when he loses assistants, even when he loses players, right? Even when he moves on from certain players, it's plug and play and the machine keeps moving and the belt keeps going. And I think when they look at the offensive side of the football, that's what they feel like they're going to have by giving more responsibility to some of the in-house guys, by bringing Joe Judge back. They don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel with the offensive playbook. And I think that that's always been the goal. And yeah, it would be great to install certain things, right? It'd be great to install an RPO package. They did run a little bit of RPO in New York with Daniel Jones. It's not something that they were at the top of the league in doing, but they definitely did it more with the Giants and the Patriots did with Mac Jones last year.
They also ran a quarterback sneak on 3rd and 9 backed up.
Oh, I'm not trying to say that he's a good coach on that side of the ball. I'm just saying that, that's a reality, right? Daniel Jones did run some RPO, some option.
Yeah.
He's a better athlete in terms of running around than people give him credit for, and his ability to move the chains with his legs. So they did do some of that. I have always stood by, and I 100% still stand by, because I get these two questions all the time. I get people that ask me, are they going to go more like Buffalo and Kansas City, right? Are they going to be spread? Are they going to run RPOs? Are they going to be college meets NFL spread system? I also get the questions of, why aren't they more like San Francisco or Los Angeles with the Rams? Why aren't they running wide zone? Why aren't they running motion and misdirection, condensed formations, and 3 wide receiver or 21 personnel like the 49ers do? They are not going to change fundamentally who they are. They are not going to change the roots of their playbook. They are not going to change the system. They are going to keep the system the same, and then they're going to adapt and integrate around that. But this goes back to Charlie Weiss. The Earnhardt Perkins verbiage actually goes back to even before Bill Belichick was here.
Right.
This goes back years and years and years into the 80s. But in terms of the actual stylistic values of the playbook, the foundational elements, the gap run schemes, pulling guards, power schemes, fullback leads, play action off of those things, using shifts instead of using motion, using multiple personnel groupings. Those things were always going to stay. And that's just the Patriot way. And that's how it's going to be. I was hoping that they were going to at least add some things in and add some new wrinkles into that sort of thing. But fundamentally, they were never going to change the playbook.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the answer to my question, I don't imagine Joe Judge installing new concepts. I don't think he's that guy. And if it is Mick Lombardi, who's the default OC, or Nick Caley, I mean, they were here last year. We know what their offense is. So I think this is a sign that the offense is going to look very similar, at least strategically. Now, look, maybe with upgraded players, it works better. It should work better. But, in terms of the system, in terms of the X's and O's, the offense is going to look very similar in 2022 than it did in 2021.
Yeah, and I think that's honestly the goal. I think in their mind, that's the best thing and the best path forward is to keep everything the same. And I think honestly, the goal is to continue with the most continuity as they possibly can. And talking about it like this and talking about Joe Judge having all this responsibility on the offense and the fact that the tea leaves now are kind of turning that Bill O'Brien is probably not going to be here next year. it's disappointing. It's worrisome. It is a little bit scary that they're going to have this approach on the offensive side of the ball, and all we can do is wait and see. In my opinion, you can't kill it until it fails, right? I mean, once it fails, then we can
Right.
come out here and call it a spade a spade. But until it fails, we can't kill it. And I think one important thing as we wrap this up and start the Q&A portion, that's important to remember. If Joe Judge ends up being the play caller, if Mick Lombardi ends up being the play caller, whoever it ends up being, everybody had no experience until they had experience, right? Whether it's Bill Belichick, whether it's Josh McDaniels, whether it's Romeo Crennel or Gerard Mayo or Brian Flores or Matt Patricia, everybody once was a position coach. They once were an assistant. They once had zero play calling responsibilities. And then all of a sudden they were given that by earning it. And the rest is history. So everyone started somewhere. Bill started on special teams, right? He was a special teams coordinator and turns into the greatest defensive coach of all time. So everybody starts somewhere. And maybe you just need to give somebody a chance. And it could work out as easily as it could not, honestly.
The one thing I'd say is, Gerard, Steve, remember the Patriots used in the preseason, even when I think Matt Patricia was their last defined defensive coordinator, right? But in the preseason, when Matt Patricia was DC, Brian Flores would get to call plays in the preseason. Yeah. Gerard Mayo would get to call plays in the preseason. Steve did. I don't know that was the case on the offensive side of the ball. These guys might have, outside of Judge, not even preseason experience. So you're right. You haven't done it until you've done it.
Right.
And it's going to be an interesting storyline to follow in the preseason. And obviously teams don't call their full playbook in the preseason, but it's something to watch.
The funniest thing about the preseason last year was that Giants preseason game might have been the best game plan the Patriots had all year. They ran multiple RPOs. They ran a lot of Haas. They ran a lot of their stuff, but they ran a lot of new stuff too that I thought was going to be in that playbook all year long. And then week one came around and it all just disappeared.
Well, they were throwing Isaiah Zuber and Christian Wilkerson. Those guys aren't on the roster. You can't run their routes. So
the two games where they had,
maybe Lombardi was calling plays in that game.
Who knows?
Who knows? So there you go.
Right. The two best games that they had from an offensive standpoint, all jokes aside about the preseason, was that game in week 7 against the Jets, right? They scored 50 points on the Jets. Yeah. And they had Jonnu Smith involved in the first half before he got hurt. And they really, even though it was the Jets, I get that. In terms of the actual sequencing and the plays that were actually being relayed and being called, that was the best utilization of the personnel that they had on offense all year. So if they can get back to that script and that game plan offensively, then I think they'll be fine. And if they can identify that, I think they'll be fine too. And I also think you talked about quarterbacks, coaches, and who's in Mac's ear and all that kind of stuff. Maybe Bill thinks he's going to have a more hands-on approach with Mac. And we always knew that Bill had a big hands-on approach with the quarterback to begin with. He was always in the quarterback's ear. He had those Tuesday meetings with Tom Brady. Maybe that is the plan. Part of the plan too is not necessarily Bill Belichick calling plays on offense or anything like that, but him just having a more hands-on approach with Mac Jones and the ins and outs of Mac Jones's progression in year 2. Well, let's get to some questions.
Well, so there's a really interesting question in there, and it's a good transition here.
Yes.
Court P, if you go back a little bit, could there be a camp battle for the offensive coordinator position? That's an interesting one. I wouldn't put it past Bill. I could see that we wouldn't know. They wouldn't talk about it. It wouldn't be public. But I could see them doing that. I could actually absolutely see them doing that.
So maybe, especially I would also say in the preseason games, right? Or if they have joint practices where you're actually calling plays against the defense, maybe some games it's a Mick Lombardi game, some games it's Joe Judge some maybe Nick Caley gets a game, right? And you split it up between those 3 guys and see who kind of handles the responsibilities the best. The unfortunate thing is that won't go out. We won't be able to necessarily tell. Like, we can go and watch the camp battles at a position group and watch that ins and outs of that. We'll have to really do our best sort of investigative work,
sleuthing,
to try to figure out who the heck is actually calling the plays on a given drive or in a given game or whatever. But yeah, that would be all sorts of fun if that's really the case.
That's a good question.
A position where they have play callers competing for play calling duties.
Let's keep that. Let's remember that question come the summer, because I want to check back in on that. That's an interesting concept.
I like it. All right, let's talk about wide receivers. That's the other one that everybody wants to talk about. We got to start with wide receivers. Odell Beckham Jr. made some headlines. Andrew Callahan, the Boston Herald, got on his Zoom call and asked him how close he was to signing with the Patriots. Did notice that Odell had to say that he probably would have signed here if Tom Brady was still the quarterback, but we're not going to open up that can of worms. I think what it does show, and although Odell probably would have came here on a discount, so it's not quite the same as shelling out the Brinks truck or making a trade with a first round pick for a wide receiver trade or something like that. I do think it shows that Bill Belichick is still swinging at that position, right? And he's still trying to get one of the guys to be at the top of that depth chart. So when this question comes in, what is your confidence level that they chase a dominant wide receiver? My confidence level that they chase one is through the roof, right? 10 out of 10, 100%, whatever you want to put on it. My confidence level that they actually land that guy, that might be a little bit of a different question, but they've been chasing that wide receiver for a couple of off seasons now. They might not necessarily have hit it, right? But not necessarily gotten the guy, but they've been after it for a while.
Yeah. And I think you look at the kind of players they were talking to at the Senior Bowl, and neither of those guys are that top flight, Chris Olave category or any the Bama guys. There's like 5-6 names you could pull out. John Dotson, but Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs are big, they're fast, and they're downfield players.
Right.
Like they are shot play, throw it deep, home run players. And so those are the only 2 meetings we know about right now, but that was their first 2 meetings. That tells you that they want those guys. I don't think either of those guys would be upgrades over Nelson Aguilar, at least not right away. But they're in that mold. They're in that Nelson Aguilar mold. So if they're poking around that kind of player, that tells me they're looking to upgrade that role or supplement that role and maybe have – because what they've really had is – I'm trying to think of a way to not super dumb this down. But basically, they've had a downfield guy and then 2 short to intermediate guys.
Right.
And I wonder if they would switch to – because the idea is – the deep guy keeps things honest and you run everything underneath. I wonder if they would want another guy like Aguilar, opposite Aguilar, to just force the defense all the way back and then just pick it apart underneath, something like that. Or, I'm kind of rambling here, but
no, I mean, in the 07 offense, and just for example, is always the golden goose, right? That's what they're always chasing. They had Randy Moss and Dante Stallworth.
Right. So are they poking around for a Dante Stallworth type?
Right.
It seems like it.
Christian Watson from North Dakota State. I've been trying to get my hands on more North Dakota State film, but I've watched a few games of his, and that guy is a really interesting prospect because he is not as stiff or as rigid as what you would expect a 6'5" receiver to be. He's nimble. He's fluid. I wouldn't say he's got the quickest feet in the world, but he's got change of direction ability. And it doesn't look like he's struggling to run or like he's got cement in his shoes, right? He looks like he can move. They actually used him a lot on end arounds, jet sweeps. They handed the football off to him a couple of times last season as a running back, like out of the backfield, hand him the ball like the Niners do with Deebo Samuel. So you don't do that with a player that can't shake a little bit, right? That doesn't have any elusiveness, doesn't have any explosiveness. So he's a really interesting player. His vertical breaks are certainly better than his little jitterbug breaks, right? He's not a Julian Edelman, but he can break at the top of the route. I think he can create some separation down the field, and he certainly can create separation with his speed and then obviously with his size down the field to win on jump balls and things like that. But I was really, really impressed with how smooth and fluid of an athlete he is. He is not your typical N'Keal Harry, 6'5", big-bodied receiver that's just going to win by playing basketball out there, right? And playing contested catches, that sort of game. He can really run, and he's a smooth guy. So he's going to rise up boards. I think a lot of people slept on him. Big Senior Bowl week. He's a top 100 pick for sure. He might even be higher. I think that he could be a top 50, top 75 guy when all things are said and done.
He's really raw, technically. Yeah. And that's, again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Like, who's coaching him up? Who's working with him? What does the offensive support staff look like? I wouldn't hate it if they took him. I don't think he can be your only move. Like, if they added him to, I mean, just the name that's on the top of the board. Like, if they added him to, like, Chris Godwin, that's an amazing signing. Because there is a little bit of Godwin in his game. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I feel like there's a little bit of Godwin in what he does. So having him being able to work with somebody like Chris Godwin could be big. Did you watch Dubs at all?
The one that he gets a ton of comparisons to is actually the other Bucs receiver, is Mike Evans, right?
Is he that strong?
I don't know if he's that strong. He is a little bit more, I guess, leaner than
slender,
Mike Evans. Right? Slender, yeah. So I don't think that he's quite that strong. He's probably a little bit more fluid than Mike Evans is, but not as physically imposing as Mike Evans is. But at North Dakota State, that was the moniker, right? He was the FCS Mike Evans, right? That's the sort of guy that he was for them. If you're going to chase that player, at least if they took a guy like Christian Watson on day 2, I would say that was learning from the N'Keal Harry mistake, because N'Keal is stiff. He's robotic in his movements, right? He's rigid. He doesn't have loose hips. He doesn't have change of direction skill. Christian Watson's nothing like that. He's not as physically imposing. He's not as strong as N'Keal Harry is, but he's a lot looser, and he's got that ability to get in and out of breaks, right? So I think that's a much better indication that they have moved on from the Chad Jacksons and N'Keal Harry types of receivers and onto a little bit more explosiveness and fluidity.
Have you watched Dubs or at all, or no?
Not as much as Watson. Some of these guys, you got to get the tape on them, and I don't.
That's right. Like, I haven't seen a ton. I kind of just going off the scouting reports. It sounds like he's a very similar player. He's a little more technically. He's not quite as explosive, but he's a little more technically sound. So it's what you want, because I wonder if they would lean. They're both about in the same spot on the board right now, consensus. So I'm trying to think, like, well, if they're both there, who do the Patriots take? I feel like they may lean Dubs, but I think it's too early to make a definitive decision on that.
Yeah. So somebody was in the, I want to move over to defense for a second.
Okay.
Somebody was in the chat last week asking us about Cameron Thomas till they were blue in the face. I don't know if that person is back this week, but I did get to watch some Cameron Thomas today, finally. And so I can give a more in-depth answer as to what I think of the player. First and foremost, at that level, at San Diego State, dominant tape. Like, it's really difficult to find flaws to his game at that level of competition. Obviously, you worry about the jump up, right? You don't know if he's going to translate fully to the NFL. But what I liked most about him, and I think what the Patriots might like about him, is his versatility. This is a guy that can line up pretty much anywhere on the line of scrimmage. He can reduce inside on passing downs. He rushed a little bit at San Diego State as a nose tackle on third down, right over the center, and that sort of role. I think he can play anywhere. He's got great length, great explosiveness, first step ability, get out of his stance and threaten the edge. Awesome, just combination of size, length, power, all those types of things. But you always have concerns about the jump up in competition. And those are the things for him. Logan Hall from Houston's another guy who I think has excellent tape, really good physical tools, but he'll also have a little bit of jump up. These two guys are probably like day 2 defensive line prospects.
I just don't know I could see them taking Thomas. It's just, he's going to get buried behind all the edge guys they have. That's the concern. And when you talk about, we've talked about it with safeties at times. We talk about with Juwan Williams, did they blow the pick? Did they blow the evaluation? Maybe that's part of it. But the other thing is, when these guys don't get to play, they don't develop. And what happened with Juwan Williams is they drafted him high and then basically sat him for 3 years because they had so much depth ahead of him. All those guys were on multi-year deals at the time of the pick. I just worry, if you take a guy like Cameron Thomas, is he going to play? Is he going to play? What's his role? Are they going to put him on the field over Matthew Judon? Are they going to put him on the field over Kyle Van Noy? Are they going to put him on the field over even Christian Barmore, right? You talk about him rushing from the nose. they're not going to play him over Barmore.
Right. So the question is he more, because he's 265, 270, right? He's a big guy. So is he more like Dietrich Wise than a stand-up outside rush linebacker like a Matthew Judon, right? Is that more of a role that he could play with the Patriots? But whenever you look at this with the Pats, I always look for guys that go to a little bit smaller schools, right? Because they do tend to pay more attention to those types of guys than maybe other teams would, or give them more credence than other teams would. And versatility from a defensive line perspective to line up in multiple alignments on the defensive line is always something that they like to do, because they change. They're a hybrid front defense. They're a base 3-4, but they run a bunch of different fronts. So they want guys that can line up from all different rush spots and be able to survive, whether they're reduced inside, whether they're out over the tackle. They wanted those guys to be able to move around. And I think that a guy like Cam Thomas or a guy like Logan Hall from Houston do those types of things. And I do think we got to talk about line. I think that's a spot that we definitely need to concentrate a little bit more on. Not us personally, we talk about it all the time, but just in terms of looking at their building for this offseason.
I just think if they're going defensive line, I think it's more of a, they're going more the mold of a tackle, and maybe a tackle end. But like I look at a guy like Perion Winfrey, right, who's the MVP of the Senior Bowl.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder if they look for essentially another Christian Barmore type to play next to Barmore. And, here's all this athleticism coming right up the middle. Generally, correct me if I'm wrong, generally guards are less athletic than tackles.
Yeah.
Right? So, all right, well, let's put our most athletic defensive lineman right in the middle. And I look at Winfrey, and I mean, he's rushing from all three spots. Great athlete, especially for his size, all of that. Like, I think if he's about the same spot. I think he's consensus. Let's see here. Winfrey right now is consensus 64. Yeah, I don't know where. I think Thomas is in like the low 60s. They're about the same spot. I think they look at a guy like Perion Winfrey, and they like, if that's the choice, I think they go with a guy like Perion Winfrey, a tackle end, as opposed to a guy who's maybe an end linebacker hybrid.
Yeah. It's an interesting question of how do you build the middle of that line? Do you go, we love Jordan Davis, right? Jordan Davis. Do you go more with the Jordan Davis type where you have a true nose tackle, or do you go with a guy like Winfrey, or you go with a guy like Wyatt from Georgia, right? Who's
Devontae Wyatt. Yep.
Yeah. From a pass rush standpoint, Wyatt is much, much better than Jordan Davis is. And I think a lot of teams in today's NFL are going to look at it and say that we're going to have Wyatt higher than Jordan Davis on our board because of his pass rush ability. But do the Patriots?
I still think you're sleeping on Davis as a pass rusher. But anyway, continue.
Well, Davis only played 155 snaps last year, right? Because they took him off the field. And Georgia had all sorts of bodies on defensive line, right? They go on and on the defensive line. So they had that ability to rotate, but he was a run-stopping nose tackle even for Georgia, right? I mean, they took him off the field. Now, Christian Barmore also took off the field a lot at Bama. Early down run defense, they had stouter guys, right, that they went to there. So it's just sometimes that's just the difference between being a program like Alabama or Georgia that goes 8, 9, 10 deep on the defensive line because they're Alabama and Georgia, right? And they got some freshman who's going to be a first-round pick in 2 years. That might be a little bit of a difference. But, yeah, it's an interesting conversation that we can get into as the months progress here towards the draft of, do you try to pair Barmore with another Barmore, or do you try to pair Barmore with Will Fork? Right. And do you try to get a true nose tackle, or you try to pair him with two athletic guys on the interior? I can be convinced either way. It's a really interesting conversation.
Well, I think I still don't think Davis gets to 21. I still don't think he does. I think somebody's going to recognize the value. All it takes is one team. Not every team has to love him that much. I think one team will. But I think if you're starting to have that conversation, then, okay, is it Perion Winfrey or Travis Jones?
Right.
I think if you want to start talking about pairing him with Will Fork, you want to talk about a Will Fork type of guy, I think that's Travis Jones.
Yeah. Or John Ridgeway, who might be a little bit later on day 2 or early day 3 type of prospect, true nose tackle as well, that played well down at the Senior Bowl too.
Marquand McCall.
Yeah, it's a good conversation. It really is. And when you look at teams for Jordan Davis, when we start doing the mock drafts on the podcast, Alex, we can look at who's an odd front, right? Because that's going to be huge for Jordan
Right.
Davis. Most 4-3 teams are not going to draft Jordan Davis, right? He can obviously play 4-3-1 tech, right? He can play the
Right.
one technique, the shaded nose tackle position in an even front. But more than likely, he's most valuable to the odd front teams, right? The teams that are going to run a 3-4 that need a true interior nose tackle, a Vince Wilfork. So those teams are going to prioritize a guy like Jordan Davis at the top of the board.
For what it's worth, I mean, do you want to know which teams he's being mocked to the most?
Yes.
Through the mock draft so far. So based on NFL mock draft database.com, great website, check them out. They don't pay me. I'm just a fan. The three most, I would say about half of his mock drafts have him going to either the Ravens, the Chargers, or the Vikings.
Right. So the Ravens and the Vikings have new staff. So I'm not 100% because the Ravens moved on from Wink Martindale, right? So I don't know what their defense is necessarily going to look like. Same with the Vikings, who I don't think, because Kevin O'Connell hasn't technically been hired yet, I don't think that they have a DC. But looking at a team like the Chargers, that makes a lot of sense because Brandon Staley runs a different style of a 3-4 defense than the Patriots do, but they are predominantly an odd front team. So I could definitely see them going in that direction. And they're a team that struggled mightily against the run last year and needs to upgrade their defensive line, because in order for that Brandon Staley scheme to work, as we saw with the Rams, you have to have a dominant defensive line, because you're going to play a lot of those two deep shells. You're going to be a man short in the box. You can't get away with that if you don't have a great D line. So I could definitely see the Chargers, who are what, 19?
17. And he's also the consensus 17th pick. Well, so here's what's interesting about this. And this is what goes to my theory about his stocks maybe being undersold. He's a consensus 17th best player in the draft right now, according to multiple big boards. So you talk about the Ravens and the Vikings as teams with new staffs who are building an identity. Well, what do you do when you're kind of resetting the roster? You just go out and you get talent.
Right.
And then you fit the scheme to that talent. You put players in around him. So that tells me some people recognize the value of Davis in, well, let's just get this guy because he's freaking good.
Yeah.
And then we'll build the defensive personnel and scheme from there. Like, I think he's that kind of player. And at least it looks like some other teams recognize that as well.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. All right, let's talk corners.
I was going to say, do you want to do the Deflategate thing?
We can definitely get to that, because I'm sure both of us.
I want to get to that, but let's do that at the end.
Yeah. Let's talk about corners here for a second. We can start with J.C. Jackson, then we can get into some names in the draft. I think still, if I'm making a 5-point plan for the Patriots in this offseason, keeping J.C. Jackson in the building is number one. I hope that it's not on the franchise tag. I actually think that tagging him and keeping him on the tag really handicaps them, because if they just pay him a multi-year deal, they can spread out the cap hits and make it less so effective on the salary cap. But looking at their cornerback depth, is J.C. Jackson the best cornerback in the league? No. Is he top 5? I don't think so. But is he top 10, top 12, right? Is he in the
top 10?
Yeah, he's definitely up there. He is one of the best cornerbacks or at the upper tier of cornerbacks in the NFL. When you're a man coverage heavy system like the Patriots are, and you got a guy like JC that not only plays man, but also turns it over, right? Has the interception numbers. You don't just let that talent walk out the door. I know that we're so accustomed to the Patriots just not skipping a beat and letting J.C. Jackson walk and bringing in somebody else and getting similar production out of that player. But I really feel like the Patriots are in a spot now with the team, and I think they made this clear last offseason with the way that they attacked the offseason, that they got to start shelling out real market value numbers for some of these guys. And I think JC's at the very top. I mean, what more could you possibly do in terms of earning it than what J.C. Jackson has done in his first 4 years?
Pick the ball off against the Bills, but no, they need to keep him. They need to keep him. He's the best player on their defense. Is that a hot take? I don't think so.
No. Not only Matthew Judon was at one point, but I think J.C. Jackson was the most consistent player they had last year.
Well, so I was going to say, if he's not the best, he's the most valuable, and you kind of just laid out why. Given the way that, like, if they lose J.C. Jackson, they may have to remake their entire defensive scheme. Right. Then you start talking about, you might have to start talking about going and getting those 220-pound linebackers, the Matt Milanos, and playing defense that way, and your linebackers are involved in coverage. They don't want to do that. Bill doesn't want to do that. You got to keep J.C. Jackson. He's a tremendous player. He's a tremendous player that fits the scheme. He's a tremendous player that fits the scheme, that's done every single thing you've asked of him. I wouldn't be surprised if JC's going to want to get his money. And I don't blame him for it. Not one bit. I could see it being a thing where he gets tagged and then it's renegotiated into an extension down the line. Like, that's kind of what I'm preparing for. I think he's going to want to take care of himself. And unless they blow him away with the deal, which maybe they will, but unless they blow him away right away, I think he gets tagged and then they negotiate a long-term deal at some point in that negotiation window. That's not any inside information. That's just how they've done business in the past, how things have been done around the league. That's just kind of an educated guess on what I think will happen. But the possibility of losing him is real. He could get tagged, hold out, and then they have to deal him. They can't let him walk. At the very, very, very least, they have to trade him. They have to tag him and trade him. And then, look, maybe if you do that, you move up in the draft. You take, who's the guy from Clemson you like? Booth, right? Andrew Booth?
Yeah, Andrew Booth Jr.
Like, maybe you do that. You trade him. You get an extra first. You trade the 2 firsts. You move up. But they got to figure out a way to keep him. I think keeping him is priority number one this offseason.
Whenever the Patriots have had good defense here, whenever the Patriots honestly have won Super Bowls under Bill Belichick, they've had a great secondary. They've had elite cornerback talent. They've had a great secondary. J.C. Jackson gives you a pillar. He gives you one guy, right? And maybe they still need to go out and upgrade the second cornerback spot, or maybe in a dream world, they draft a guy like Andrew Booth Jr. and Andrew Booth Jr. becomes the Stephon Gilmore and J.C. Jackson is a very, very high-end number 2, right? Maybe that's the dream scenario.
Or the other way around.
Or the other way around. And he's only 26 years old. He's still entering his prime. And from JC's perspective, even if you sign a 3, 4, or 4 year deal with the Patriots at 26, you probably still have one more big contract. So you're probably going to get 2 bites at this, right? So I think that that's another part of this equation for JC as well. I personally am comfortable giving JC Jackson at an average annual value, which does not equate to cap hits, right? We had Miguel on a couple of weeks ago, and he explained this. I'm comfortable with giving JC Jackson a 4-year, $80 million contract. It's a lot of money, but I'm comfortable doing it because they'll stagger the cap hits. They'll be strategic about it. I'm sure the 3rd and 4th years won't be fully guaranteed. You're probably looking at a real 2 or 3 year deal. You load it up with guarantees early on. You keep the cap hits low for now, and let's let this thing ride out, right? Especially with Mac Jones on his rookie contract. I don't think that that's a huge overpay for J.C. Jackson.
See, you mentioned Mac Jones' rookie contract. That's a really interesting one. I actually think it's a win-win for JC and the Patriots to sign a 3-year deal. Yeah. Because for JC, he hits the market under 30, right? He'd be 29. And I know it's just 1 year, but there's a big difference between as somebody who's not quite 30, but almost 30, there's a big difference between 29 and 30. And I think for the Patriots, it lines him up with the end of Mac's deal, at least the end of his concrete deal. Maybe with the rookie option, this changes, but the Patriots get big money off the books as they need to pay Mac Jones, and J.C. Jackson gets to hit the open market, potentially under the age of 30. So
and you can grease up that, like I threw out 4 for 80. You could give him 3 for 60 and have it be heavily guaranteed early in the contract. Right. And JC walks away with $30 million on signing. Right. I mean, that's a pretty good deal for JC Jackson. So I think that that's a really good way of going about it. I think a lot of players in free agency over the last couple of years you have seen have gone with 2 or 3 year contracts so that they can keep hitting the open market and keep maximizing their value. It makes a lot more sense from a football perspective for players too, to not sign these big 5-6 year contracts unless you're a quarterback. Obviously.
Well, so this is a new thing because the long-term deals used to be an advantage for the player, right? You get your long-term financial security. Even if you get hurt, you're getting paid, all of that. And I think as, some of these significant injuries, torn ACLs, all of that, as they become easier to come back from, I think that the belief is now shifting. And I think you are seeing those short-term deals valued more by players. I think the teams will take it. I think the teams are fine with it. I don't know that it's better or worse for them. But I think those short-term deals, I think like 4 to 5 year deals soon are going to be like really long deals. I think you're going to start seeing a lot more 2 and 3 year deals in the NFL. And I think, again, for the Patriots and for JC Jackson, I think a 3-year deal makes a ton of sense for both sides. And then you figure out the money, 60, maybe even 65, right? If they need to grease the wheels, something like that.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think we should pitch this and get that contract done for JC Jackson, right? That seems to be the starting point, I think, for him. And I think that's totally fair. He's 26 years old, and since he stepped foot in the NFL, he leads the entire NFL in interceptions, I believe, since he got to the NFL. That type of guy, regardless of the tape's inconsistent against Stephon Diggs or not, he's going to get paid by somebody, whether it's you or it's somebody else. He's going to get a huge, huge deal because of those numbers. And that's just a reality of the situation. Talking about other corners, I can't find the other question about first round corners, day 2 corners. I watched a little bit of corners this week and last. I got to be honest, the day 2 corners, I wasn't crazy about any of the options to begin with. Andrew Booth Jr. is the best fit for the Patriots in the draft. I think that's not, they're not getting Amon Gardner. They're not getting Derek Stingley, right? So we're starting from the 3rd best corner on the board is going to be Andrew Booth Jr. I think once Andrew Booth Jr. tests, assuming that he does test at his pro day or at the combine, he's going to be a top 15, top 20 guy. He's
consensus 16 right now.
He is an unbelievable athlete. So I assume he's going to run extremely fast and look incredible in the underwear Olympics, right? When he gets out there at the combine and pro days and stuff like that, people are going to awe over that guy. So I think he's going early. In terms of the other corners, it gets kind of tough at that point. I don't know. There's not a great answer. I think the best answer that I probably have out of these day 2 guys is maybe like a Darion Kendrick from Georgia or a Josh Jobe from Alabama. Now, I know Alabama fans are not so high on Josh Jobe because he gets a lot of penalties. He's grabby. He's a physical guy. Those are the concerns, but he would be your managed number 2 on the outside. Move Jalen Mills to more of a 3rd corner rover role, which we've talked about in the past. And Jobe would be game planned for, right? You put him up against big physical Mike Williams, Corey Davis type of receivers. You wouldn't put him up against the jitterbugs, right? You wouldn't put him in that types of situations. Maybe he's a guy that could go up against a guy like Gabriel Davis when they play Buffalo, for example. So those are a few, right? I think a guy like Jobe is an interesting one just because when you watch Alabama, it's like you're watching the Patriots defense, right? They play man,
right?
They play a very similar coverage system. As for like the Washington guys, I think are really talented, right? Like Trent McDuffie and the other guy from Washington, I'm blanking on, but they're such a zone heavy D that it's hard to see much translation there.
Yeah, I almost start looking further down at that point. And I agree with you. I don't love the day 2 corners.
Yeah.
Their ability recognizing late round UDFA corners. I almost wonder if you bring in a couple of those guys and take a couple shots at the, couple shots at it that way. Tariq Woolen's a guy I've talked a lot about. Jalen Watson out of Washington State. Seven Banks from Ohio State. Just these, they're physically built like Patriots corners. They're good athletes. Just bring 3 or 4 of them in between late round picks, UDFAs, and see if you can get one of them where you need him to go. Right. I think that kind of, I almost feel like that's the plan. And then maybe you go out and you hedge your bets and you sign a veteran, like a 1-year, $8 million guy. I saw somebody bring up Patrick Peterson in the chat. Patrick Peterson's not replacing JC Jackson, which is what the comments said, but you hedge your bets on all these young guys with Patrick Peterson. And then, you got 3 or 4 bites at the apple and hopefully one of them works out. You find a second corner. So I almost feel like that's their best bet at this point. I think corner's a tremendous need. But as long as JC Jackson's on the roster, it doesn't make a ton of sense in this draft for them to spend a lot of draft capital on the position, unless a guy like Booth falls.
Right.
I almost feel like you go to the 3rd round, you go to the UDFAs, and you see what you can find. I feel like you're going to get just as lucky there. You have just as good of a shot there as you do at pick 50, whatever. And so then why waste 50, whatever on a corner?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's, I know that's not what people want to hear. I know it's not the sexy
answer.
I think I kind of think that's the plan, though.
I think you're spot on, because if they can get a guy like Andrew Booth Jr. in the 1st round, now you have Gilmore, JC, Revis, Browner, you have a real tandem, right? That's in my mind, in a year or two, maybe even right away, but certainly by Andrew Booth Jr.'s second year in the league, might be one of the best cornerback tandems in the NFL. So that's building your defense around those two guys, right? That's really doing that sort of thing. But to waste a day 2 pick on like a Job or a Kobe Bryant from Cincinnati, who I liked initially, but then you dig in a little bit more, and he's got some speed issues, long speed movement down the field, things like that. Darian Kennard, like I mentioned, or Kendrick, excuse me, from Georgia. He's okay. I think he's a good athlete. I think that he's somebody that's interesting. I don't really love all of them, though. I really don't have one guy on day 2 that I'm pounding the table for. That's my guy.
Like we had, who was the one last year? My guy was Stokes, Eric Stokes, and he actually had a good year in Green Bay. Like
he ended up being a first rounder, unfortunately.
Right? Yeah, I was trying to take Eric Stokes in the second round of like every mock, and I knew I was pushing it maybe a little bit. I
thought he was going to be an early second round pick too.
I did. That's kind of where I was at. But yeah, there were a couple guys last year. Stokes is just one name I remember. But I remember there were a bunch of corners in that like 30 to 60 range last year that we were obsessed with. I think this year that position is linebacker, right?
Yeah.
We've got, there's Chad Mumma, there's Christian Harris from Alabama.
Yeah. Quay Walker, all the Georgia guys.
Quay Walker, right. Like that's that position this year. Last year, like I'm trying to look back at the big board from last year to remember who some of these guys were. Cause now I'm like, yeah, like you had all these guys, like you had Caleb Fairley, you had Eric Stokes, you had Obi Melifonwu's brother, whose first name I can't pronounce, Tyson Campbell. Like there were all these guys that was like, they're going to go like 30 to 60.
Yeah.
Those guys just don't exist in this draft. They don't. It's not the same kind of class.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised. You look at the cornerback board. I think end of the first round, you're going to get into the Elams, the McDuffies, probably are going to go there. Maybe Kyler Gordon from Washington, who's talented. Roger McCreary. Then I think there's going to be a pretty significant gap between that run of late first round, early second round corners, and then when the next batch goes, the Jobs, the Bryants, and those guys, I think that there's going to be could be a 40-50 pick gap before you see another run at corner. So it's an interesting position this year because there are really great guys at the top, and then there's some really good maybe mid-round pick value potentially, but not a lot of great guys in the top 50, top 75.
And maybe that works the Patriots' advantage. Maybe teams just say, hey, we don't love any of these corners. We'll wait till later in the draft. And all of a sudden, Josh Jobe is there at the end of the third round, as opposed to taking him early in the second. Right. So maybe that's how it comes together. The quarterback position is going to be fascinating this year.
Yeah. And as we get into the mock draft season too, we'll do all the trade down scenarios, right? We've talked about multiple times. It feels
like a trade down year.
It feels like a trade down year unless they get a Booth or they get a Jordan Davis or they really want to swing with a wide receiver or something like that at the top of the draft. But we'll get into that. Let's wrap it up on the Deflategate story. This is the story first and foremost, and I'm going to get mad with you because I also think it's ridiculous. But this story does not die. Like this story just doesn't die, and it's so juicy and it's so headline grabby that you can write about it. We're 4 or 5 years later now, and 6 years, and
eight. It was 2014, right?
Technically, but he got suspended in 16, right? Because it went on for so freaking long.
So it's 6 years since the end of it, 8 years since the beginning of it. Yeah.
It's so long ago. Tom Brady is now retired, and we can still talk about it. We can still talk about this and get all sorts of buzz about this conversation. For those that don't know, Pro Football Talk, Mike Florio came out with a report over the weekend, essentially saying that the NFL has data, PSI data from footballs around the same time as Deflategate that essentially say that the entire freaking thing was a hoax, right? The entire thing they put out, was it Troy Vincent, right, who worked in the league office at the time, put out faulty numbers to Chris Mortensen. That 11 out of 12 underinflated number was thrown out by the league office, was not true. The PSI numbers were consistent with PSI numbers across the league at temperatures in that were accurate of that AFC Championship game that night against Indianapolis. The entire freaking thing was a sham. We already knew this in New England. Every single time I get into my car in the winter and the tire pressure light is on, I think of Deflategate. It's impossible not to. But your reaction to this, Alex, because I know this rightfully everybody in New England is pissed off about this.
I want an apology.
Yeah.
I want the first round pick back. I don't know whether or not that's going to happen, because let's not forget Jeff Pash, the NFL's general counsel, who had those records destroyed.
Right.
Jeff Pash is also the one. There's another issue with Jeff Pash being buddy with Washington football team.
Right.
And maybe helping cover some of their scandals up. So maybe recoup that first round pick from Washington football team, but that's another story. This is vindication.
Yeah.
This report was not new to anybody in New England. It was confirmation of what we had already known. And people like Jerry Thornton, people like really Michael Hurley, who had done this legwork and informed us and did a great job. I am so happy for those guys. But this can never be a debate again, because anytime anybody brought this nonsense up, we would come back with that, with exactly what Florio's reporting. People say, well, where's the proof? And there was no proof. We just knew.
Yeah.
We tried to tell you all this for years, that the NFL baselessly investigated and then suspended Tom Brady.
Yeah.
And it was, to finally see it in writing and to have Vincent's name in there and Pash's name in there. Oh, that felt good.
Yeah.
Oh, that felt good, because we were right. We were right the whole freaking time. And the NFL suspended the greatest player in the history of the game for no reason, knowing full well. It's not even that they suspended him for no reason. It's one thing if they thought they had a reason and then, other information comes out and, oh, we screwed up. That's not great, but it happens.
Right.
They had the information. They had the data that said Deflategate, what it actually was a seventh grade science project gone wrong, to use Michael Hurley's term. The ideal gas law, like you mentioned, the air in the tires in the car. They had that information. And Jeff Pash threw it in the furnace. I don't know if that's because he's a lawyer. Let me say that's a metaphor. I don't know what he actually did with it. It said he had it expunged. But you get my point. They had the vindicating information, and it was used. It was used in the court. Michael, I'm blanking on his last name. I think it's McCann, who's a sports lawyer, tweeted this out. When the suspension appeal went to court, they used data the NFL had on air pressure in footballs. We now know that data was incomplete. So a court decision was made with incomplete data, which was willingly incomplete because the NFL took the completed data and expunged it. We were right all along. The NFL set Tom Brady up. They took him down without cause. And does it feel good to say that with some backing? Oh, does it feel good?
Yeah. And I would just add that you're not getting your first round pick back. Robert Kraft's not getting his $1 million.
Can we fight for it? Why can't we fight for it?
No, I don't want to fight for that. What I want to fight for is a public apology from the league to the greatest player in the history of the league. And the fact that they railroaded the GOAT of all GOATs in Tom Brady publicly, drove him through the mud, took him to court, did the whole thing. Could you imagine if the NHL did this to Wayne Gretzky?
Well, not even that. They had Peyton Manning on camera talking about ordering steroids, and they brushed it under the rug.
Right.
But Evan, I got to tell you, there's a better chance they get back the first round pick than Roger Goodell apologizes to Tom Brady for doing the Patriots. Let's be honest.
When Tom Brady is about to get inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I want Raj to get up there and say, and by the way, Tom, as we're inducting you in, first ballot, and rightfully so, we apologize for our actions in Deflategate, and you are vindicated, and that is being strucken. That suspension and all of it is being strucken from your record officially. I'm sure that they keep some sort of suspension record, right? That they can have some sort of ceremonial moment where they take it off of Tom Brady's record that he was suspended in 2016. But as much as I wish that the Patriots could get their first round pick back, because we would love to talk about having 2 first round picks. That would be great for us. Yeah. Right. And as much as I would love for Robert Kraft's wallet to be a little bit thicker. I mean, I don't know. I don't really care so much about Rob's wallet, not going to lie. But regardless of that,
it's the significance of the matter, or the what is it? The what of the matter? The principle of the matter.
The principle. It's Brady. We should all 110% be asking, be petitioning, be arguing with the league to give Brady his apology, because look, I was about to say Michael Jordan, but that's kind of a bad example for this. But Michael Jordan was, the things that went on with Michael Jordan behind the scenes in the NBA was gambling related, and that's a whole different can of worms, right? So let's go back to Wayne Gretzky. The NHL would never drag Wayne Gretzky like this. Boxing would never drag Muhammad Ali like this, right? I mean, you're talking about the greatest athlete in the history of your sport. And the only thing that I can possibly think of that could really do it justice now is if the league office were to come out and apologize and say that they were wrong about it, because there are still going to be people, and I know that they're dumb, and I know that we should pay no mind to them, but there's still going to be people that are going to use Deflategate against Tom Brady, that are going to use Deflategate against the Patriots, and we're going to hear cheaters, and we're going to hear all this kind of stuff till the end of time. And that is all because of the misinformation and the poor reporting and the 4-game suspension and all that kind of stuff that went out there. It's on their record. Right? It's now on their record, and there's nothing that that anybody can really do to expunge it at this point. And that's the hardest part about it for me, is about legacy. You know, first round picks, $1 million. Robert Kraft already made that $1 million back 50 times, right, in the last 6 years. It's about legacy. It's about reputation. And they labeled Tom Brady a cheater when he was nothing close to cheating, other than the fact that he played his home games in New England for 20 years and it was cold out during a January playoff game. And that there is everything that you need to know. And that should be an apology to Tom Brady. But I'm glad we can finally feel vindicated. I'm glad that the ideal gas law and science proved itself to be correct. I'm glad that when I get into my car and I see the tire pressure light on, and I always think of Deflategate now, I can finally see, I knew I was right, right? We all of us up in New England understood the ideal gas law because we deal with it every single winter.
And there were kids in middle school doing science projects on it.
Right.
That had a better concept or a better grasp of the concept than the NFL and these people paid millions of dollars.
All right. Well, at least we got to revisit this 6 years later somehow and talk about this again. But it's rightfully so that we put this back out in the ether and
I look, for all the years defending the wall, we deserve our victory lap. It's not putting it back out there in the ether. It's taking our victory lap. We were right. You were wrong. Tom Brady is not a cheater. He's just better than your favorite quarterback. It's that simple.
We'll get a Deflategate 30 for 30 someday, I'm sure. Right? I mean, we got the Tuck.
And we're only going to get vindicated even more.
Yeah. Man, what a joke. All right. Well, on Thursday, Alex, very special Super Bowl preview show with Trags from Los Angeles. I know he's jacked up to do this. The three of us back together. It feels like a reunion. The three amigos returning to the airwaves together. We're going to talk Bengals Rams. We're going to talk about some things that relate to the Patriots in Bengals Rams and discuss the Super Bowl and preview the Super Bowl. And then starting next week, I think we start getting into mock draft season, Alex.
Do you want to do a mock draft next week? I think we have to do it on Thursday because we're going to want to talk about the Super Bowl on Tuesday. Am I penciling this in? Are we doing a mock draft a week from Thursday?
We are doing a mock draft a week from Thursday.
Well, hang on, though, real quick. So that means, let me test something out here real quick. The question is, are we doing it on PFF?
Yeah, we got to figure that out. You can figure that out. You're the mock draft guy, right? You're the one that I trust your opinion on these things more than myself.
They have not added punters yet, so that's
interesting. My God. Okay, I'll see if I can work on that. But mock draft, Patriots beat mock draft 1.0 next week, next Thursday. But you're going to want to listen to this Super Bowl preview show. It's going to be a lot of fun. As I mentioned, Trags is in Los Angeles, so he's got a front row seat to media week and all the media availabilities. And obviously the game on Sunday. So we'll talk to Trags, we'll talk some Super Bowl, and then it's draft season, baby. I'm excited. I've been working on the draft and researching. Alex has been doing the same. So we're really excited to really dive deep into all these prospects and scenarios and mock drafts and all that kind of stuff. So that's the plan. Thanks so much for joining us on this Tuesday evening and hanging in with us this late at night. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys Thursday for our Super Bowl preview.